Donald Trump won re-election on a platform of America First. You may have thought that your own government, the one that takes so many of your hard-earned dollars in taxes, has always put America first. But do you have any idea how much of your money the government sends to other countries every year? Did you know that your tax dollars are funding 57,000 first responders in Ukraine, while American cities are left to burn or flood? Oh, trust me, it gets much, much worse. U.S. foreign aid is used to fund wars overseas, prop up dictators, and support countries that hate America and everything we stand for. Is it time to put an end to the handouts once and for all? Get in, losers. Project DOGE is going for a drive. Every year, the U.S. government sends about $60 billion to hundreds of countries around the world. And over the last few years, with highly visible wars in both Ukraine and Israel, that number has been going up.
The United States is the world's largest giver in the world by far of foreign aid, but few give anything to us. That is why we are taking a hard look at U.S. foreign assistance.
As an advisor to the Department of Government Efficiency, former Congressman and two-time presidential candidate Ron Paul has highlighted this spending as something that should be ended immediately. Replying to Dr. Paul, Elon Musk appeared to agree. Vivek Ramaswamy adds that much of U.S. foreign aid isn't even authorized by Congress, which, according to the Constitution, is the body responsible for holding America's purse strings. Foreign aid appears to be a benevolent use of taxpayer dollars, fighting poverty, disease, and human rights abuses all over the world. In many cases, however, it's not.
As DOGE has started to dig into USAID, we're learning a lot about the corruption that agency is hiding. Since its creation by executive order in 1961, USAID has become a massive slush fund for pet projects the CIA wants to hide, including sending tens of millions of dollars to fund dangerous bioweapons agents research in Wuhan, China, believed to have caused the COVID-19 pandemic.
Dr. Paul argues that foreign aid is an unconstitutional and immoral transfer of wealth. Sending billions overseas needlessly puts the interests of other nations above those of the American citizens. And as a policy, it is divisive. A 2024 survey by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs found about half of Americans favor cutting military and economic aid to other countries, while only a small minority think we aren't doing enough. So why do we transfer so much of our nation's wealth overseas, where it is often misallocated, misappropriated, and misused? To understand why we spend so much today, we need to know where we started. After the Second World War, the Marshall Plan was used to help rebuild Europe following years of military devastation. After that, however, foreign assistance became less about recovering from a global war and more about advancing our government's political and military goals abroad. During the Cold War, we propped up inhumane military dictatorships like the one in El Salvador simply because they were opposed to communism. Then, to fight the war on drugs, we funneled billions to Colombia. What was supposed to be a crackdown on the cartels merely dispersed them into other countries like Mexico, all the while displacing Colombian peasants and creating drug war refugees all across Central America. That's right, foreign aid helped create the crisis on our southern border. Of course, the most well-known example of foreign aid gone wrong is the disastrous attempt at nation building in Afghanistan. During our 20-year occupation of the country, the U.S. provided more than $75 billion in development assistance to Afghanistan. That includes $85 million for a fancy hotel that never managed to open, and $6 million for the introduction of cashmere goats. I enjoy a good sweater as much as the next guy, but what do we have to show for all of that money but a failed state and a humiliating defeat? Even after the Biden administration's withdrawal, the U.S. continues to send aid to Afghanistan, except now it is mostly intercepted by the Taliban and is used to fund terrorist acts while their citizens starve. Afghanistan is the poster child for the abject failures of foreign aid. Today, just about every country in the world receives some sort of U.S. foreign aid, from authoritarian dictatorships to rich Western nations that really should be paying their own way.
So, for example, the World Bank will give a lot of aid to U.S. allies like Ethiopia and Uganda that are both run by tyrannical regimes that happen to be U.S. and U.K. allies in the war on terror. And so those political constraints are going to always hamper any reform efforts that you try to make.
In the case of foreign wars, we often end up funding both sides at the same time. For example, the U.S. spent $230 million on a pier which was supposed to help get humanitarian aid to Gaza. But at the same time, we're funding Israeli weapons used to blow up the same kind of infrastructure. But perhaps the best reason to end foreign aid is that it simply doesn't work.
I think the aid is all worthless. It doesn't do any good for most of the people. You take money from poor people in this country and you end up giving it to rich people in poor countries. And they're used as weapons of war, so you accomplish nothing.
Despite more than half a century of experiments, study after study reveals that U.S. foreign aid has little to no effect on reducing global poverty and promoting economic growth. In the 90s, the Clinton administration noted that decades of foreign assistance had left countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East poorer than ever. Magat Wade, director of the Center of African Prosperity, argues that in African countries, foreign aid money has created a culture of dependency and resentment. Rather than focusing on deregulation that would allow Africans to start their own businesses and create their own wealth, she argues that we've kept them reliant on handouts that do nothing to address long-term or systemic problems. And speaking of resentment, it's worth considering the kind of impression foreign aid gives to Americans. At a time when people are struggling with high fuel and food prices, when housing and medical care seem unaffordable, Congress's refusal to touch a dime of foreign aid spending sends a message that they don't care about you. At least not as much as they care about Palestinians, Israelis, and Ukrainians, all of whom receive payouts at a time when Americans are pleading for help. There's a reason why Donald Trump's America First messaging resonates with so many people. When a third of our paychecks are seized by the government each year, we want to feel like that money is going to help our fellow Americans, not be shipped off to some remote corner of the world most of us couldn't even find on a map.
With a $34 trillion debt, our foreign policy needs to re-examine all foreign aid. As a consequence of being everywhere all the time, American aid flows not only to dependent allies, but to countries that have the audacity to burn our flag.
Instead of useless handouts or the kind of nation building that failed so catastrophically in Afghanistan, we should be promoting economic freedom, which most development economists agree is more effective at lifting countries out of poverty than mere financial assistance.
We should export maybe some principles about free markets and sound money, and maybe they could produce some of their own wealth.
Given foreign aid's poor track record, its susceptibility to political capture, and a growing desire to put America first, foreign aid seems like an obvious target for reform from the Department of Government Efficiency.